You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're joined by Dr. Judy Vandewater, a leading immunologist and autism researcher at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Vandewater has dedicated her career to understanding the immunological underpinnings of autism, exploring the role of maternal immune activation and antibodies in brain development. Join us as we delve into her groundbreaking research and uncover the fascinating connections between the immune system and autism spectrum disorders. Dr. Vandewater, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Well, before we get into the details, because this is a topic that I think is going to be novel for a lot of our listeners, I'd love to kind of hear the background of, how your research and interest in the science of immunology married the field of autism and how that came about.
Yes, my career has really been all about sort of what we call clinical immunology, which is autoimmune diseases, immune-mediated disorders, allergy, those sorts of things. And in about 2000, sort of the idea of potentially other biologic systems impacting how the brain develops started to kind of really come into its own. And at that same time, the UC Davis Mind Institute was formed. They put out a call for proposals and they wanted to I think that was very forward thinking of them, bring together individuals who are working in other fields to address some of the really sort of unknown areas of autism and how we get to autism, what we potentially can do about that. And so I got one of those pilot grants and it literally changed the course of my research for the rest of my career. So that is how I got into it.
So when you were going through the process of trying to really understand the impact that some of the immunological conditions had on families, was there a connection to the families? Was there a process that you were hearing that, hold on, a lot of the common issues that people are dealing with, whether it's inflammation or whatever it could be occurring with autoimmune disorders, these families are describing with their autistic children or autistic young adults that they're caring for.
And then that is actually where the first concept came from, was families were talking about, my child I know they have immune issues. There are things that they were sort of recognizing that really early. And sometimes it's hard to get to move that ship, right? And thinking beyond sort of, this is how the brain develops, it's a neurobehavioral disorder, and kind of opening up our thinking in sort of some of the medical issues that parents face. GI issues, a big one. Sleep issues, another huge one, right? And while fundamentally autism is, we deal with behavior, these things feed into how effective treatment, intervention is, how that child feels, how that family functions, right? These are all things that are really important. And so a lot of where we started was from listening to families telling us. I started working more in looking at immune issues in the children. And then sort of the idea for looking during gestation came about somewhat from the schizophrenia literature. That was something that they had been thinking. Infection during pregnancy leads to this neurodevelopmental disorder, which we now know is we call it schizophrenia, which shows up later. But there's a lot of similarities in that sort of thinking about what's going on during pregnancy.
And that's going to take us into kind of the concept of maternal inflammation. But before we go there, what I'd love to just kind of draw the picture of is getting an understanding of, what are the common, I guess, immune disorder relations to autism. What is most common seen across the two kind of categories of, when you have an immune disorder and when you have autistic disorder, where's the overlap most frequently?
I think there are sort of two places, right? And I think that is certainly one of the challenges of working in autism is that really broad spectrum, right? There's not one way to get to autism, and so that throws in a little bit of a challenge on how we look at it. And one of the ways that we kind of think about that is what are some of the ways to get to autism, and as we narrow that down, um, two things sort of came to the forefront for us. One is the maternal immune system during pregnancy is incredibly controlled, so you don't reject the fetus, right? It is, we all get sick during pregnancy. We get, and you can't take anything for it, and you sort of, but it's part of that process is that fine balance between keeping everybody healthy, but not rejecting the fetus, right? So the immune system shifts a little bit during pregnancy. And that is one of the things that we looked at is what if it doesn't shift because you have an underlying, we call it immune dysregulation, meaning that the immune system isn't under the tight control it needs to be to, sort of to fight infection, but keep not fight your own tissues. And that is one of the things that we looked at. How does a woman's immune system differ in cases of either schizophrenia or autism, because we actually study both here. And so that if you have an infection, you fight that infection and hopefully everything doesn't like go out of control. I think we learned a lot during COVID about, sort of inflammation, cytokine storm was a term that was thrown around a lot, meaning all those proteins that the cells make to activate the immune system and to control the immune system kind of got a little bit out of control in COVID, causing, the lung pathology, having the difficulty with breathing. That is the same concept that if you have an immune event or an infectious event, your immune system should be controlled enough to fight the infection, but not keep going and have this long lasting or chronic inflammation. So that is one of the arms. The other arm is that during pregnancy, one of the protective mechanisms that we protect our fetus passively is by our antibodies, that everything that we've seen our system makes, those antibodies are transferred to the fetus to protect that fetus from those same illnesses. Unfortunately, sometimes our immune system shifts and starts what we call autoimmunity or an autoantibody response to our own tissues. And unfortunately, when those also cross the placenta, they will find their target in the fetal compartment and have an effect. And I think one of the best examples of that, systemic lupus, SLE, a very well-known autoimmune disease. Women who have that disorder often have children born with a congenital heart block because of the antibodies that have crossed the placenta. That is actually what started us thinking along the lines of autoantibodies potentially having a role in autism.
Okay. So, I mean, and so there's the possibility with dysregulation that the antibodies that are being created are the body is actually hurting itself in the process. Is that accurate? Is that what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we're looking at, most of the targets for the autoantibodies that I study are proteins that are really necessary for healthy brain development. And they're highly upregulated during that period where they kind of, as they've done their job, then they're less present, in an adult brain. We really see them highly expressed in a developing fetal brain. So that might be why a woman who has these autoantibodies doesn't see an effect in her own body like a normal autoimmune disease would, but it highly impacts how the brain develops in the fetus.
Okay. And is this how, I mean, when we're describing or when you're talking to families or when people are going through the research, is this where we get to that maternal inflammation, or how do you describe that to somebody when you're talking about the process of, fighting all these viruses or fighting any sort of immune component that's coming in, and where maternal inflammation comes into play?
So maternal inflammation, you can have maternal inflammation and autoantibodies, or you can just have maternal inflammation. And for us, it's looking at how how long does that inflammation last after an event, like an infectious event, and how high does it go? So, right, does it go above sort of that place where it's controlled, doing its job, but it's resolving, right, in a good amount of time versus up, 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 and sustained. Um, that is what we look for. Um, Everybody gets sick during pregnancy, right? We all do. But not everybody has a child with autism or schizophrenia. So what we're looking for is, where is that control mechanism that should be in place to keep this, happy, happy sort of positive response, but not overwhelmingly in check. And so that those are what we look for. Now, an important point about how the brain develops is these molecules are really important for brain development. It's a little bit like a Goldilocks effect, where if you have too much, it's bad, but if you have too little, you also don't get normal brain development. So I think, it's one of those things that you need that really perfect, that not perfect, but good balance between too high and too low for many of the factors, that we would normally think of as even inflammatory factors. So it's very complicated, but we are
No,
working very hard to understand it.
it sounds that way. And I mean, with maternal inflammation, and maybe it's just understanding for me, is that when that is occurring, what are the possibilities that that could affect a development, or to developmentally affect somebody's brain development, or kind of their ability for cognitive functioning in the future, or even in the nervous system, how all of this comes into play. How does maternal inflammation, if it isn't controlled, affect some of this?
So I think, sort of on a basic level, what it does is it changes um, the cells that come into the brain, right? So some of these factors are what we call chemokines, but what they do is they set up sort of a homing system for cells to go where they're supposed to go. Microglia, all of those sort of the cells we think of in the brain, that are part of how the neurons develop correctly. And what happens is, if you change sort of the balance of that, they're not getting the signals they should have, or they're getting too much of a signal, right? And so it's a function of timing, and cells talking to each other and telling each other, this is where you need to be, this is where you need to be, in your sort of developmental pathway. And when that doesn't happen correctly, um, it can just subtly shift or massively shift, depending on, the timing. Timing is huge. When this happens, first, second, third trimester. I mean, pregnancy itself is an interesting immune event, because what happens during pregnancy, in a normal pregnancy, is you start with your sort of, this is your pre-pregnancy immune system, and it kind of maintains that in terms of sort of what we call the cellular response. So the part we have to calm down so you don't reject the fetus. And then it kind of really dips in that second trimester, which is where we really are looking at sort of that difference between where it should be and where it might be. And then it comes back up at the end of pregnancy, and that's actually birth. You need inflammation to reject that fetus. It's fully formed now, it needs to go, right? So that is that the immune system plays a really huge part in actually the birth of a child, right? That, all right, we're kicking you out, you're done. And so if you measure it late in the third trimester, you're going to have a ton of inflammation, because that's why they tell you don't take Advil, any of those anti-inflammatory drugs during that period, because it will delay that process. It can mess up that process. At the same time, in the middle of, sort of that late first trimester through the second trimester, you want things to be very sort of, that in that happy balance between inflammation and not enough in the immune response. So I think that's what we look for, is kind of when does that shift occur, and how big is that difference between where they should be and where they are.
Where's the overlap when development is occurring and somebody is having some form of immune impact, immunological impact from whether it was maternal inflammation or something else? How does that play into language development? How does that play into sensory feedback of somebody? How does that correlate to some of the diagnostic conditions that are in place and some of the challenges somebody might face later in life?
I think for inflammation, I think we know less about that than I wish we did. I think cognition is something that we really look for, right? How, sort of developmental delay, cognitive ability um, is something that we think is highly impacted by that. We use our animal models to look at this because that's the best we have. We can't be testing humans for this, right? So we've got a variety of animal models that we use to try to understand this. I think social is always a big one, right? That it's a hallmark feature of autism, but it's also a hallmark feature of schizophrenia. So those two they're just different in what their challenges are. But when we look at sort of the sociability, the shifts are kind of interesting in our animal models. It's inappropriate social behavior is kind of a lot of what we see with inflammation. On the other side of that, the maternal autoantibody side, so this is the other major part of the work I do, we are really looking at trying to understand because we have a very defined profile that women have. So to explain the autoantibody story, and it's about 15 to 20% of women who have children with autism have these very highly specific antibodies to their 8 proteins that we've described. And against those 8 proteins, there are combinations of if you have antibodies to 2 or more of them. It's a little bit of a complicated story, but it changes very definitely how the child develops. And we've been able to, because our animal models are very, well characterized in this particular part of our research, and we have a lot of clinical data, we've been able to identify certain of these patterns have very distinct outcomes in behavior, intellectual disability. So we now use sort of the term profound autism to describe those who are just so severely impacted. They, lack of language, intellectual disability, will never be able to live on their own. So a couple of our patterns, the kids are sort of on that end of the spectrum. And then there are a couple of patterns where they have language, they have, they're a little more a higher ability. And so it's very important for us, I think, to understand how those are characterized so that we can then say, okay, these are the kids, this is what this child, because we can predict this. We can predict it before pregnancy, we can predict it at birth. Then you have the best possible chance, right, of targeting the intervention that child is going to need and hopefully preventing some of the more severe behaviors from really fully developing.
That's the piece to this that to me is, the bright light bulb kind of being shined as a lot of research really doesn't. I mean, it has value in helping us to understand, but it sounds like this takes the next step to where, you can act on it almost immediately right now. And there are preventative measures, or there's future treatment implications that can be garnered by some of the information that's coming through. So what's the path, I guess, as somebody's coming through, is that they might get tested for some of these antibodies or the reaction of the antibodies, and then that gives information back to you. Please just give us a little bit of that treatment path to understand how this comes into play.
I think, well, there are sort of 2 levels, right? And as we're working, the data on the preconception side is that's a long haul, right, question, right? Because the studies we need to do for that, we know from some of our clinical studies that if the antibodies are pregnant during pregnancy, what the outcome is going to look like. But the early detection, and we're working at even doing this, as early as at the newborn period, then sort of what you're dealing with in terms of, okay, they've got the more severe pattern. That therefore, if we can work with clinicians like yourself, what is the best intervention that we could do, and as early as we can possibly do it, right? Because now this is, I think, is really important for families that have already had a child with autism. We know, right, that their risk is higher of having a second child. They know what it's going to be like, and so they also know, what they've done with their first child in terms of intervention therapies. Could we tailor a program, for this second child to even start earlier, more effective, right, before any signs show up, right? And that, I think, gives the best possible outcome. The other side of this is, because we have the animal models that we do, there are potential therapies for blocking these antibodies from ever getting across the placenta. Remember I said they're crossing the placenta, but if we could we're working on therapeutics that if we could block that, that would just completely stop that type of autism from ever happening, or at least certainly lessen the impact of it.
And is that where the research is moving towards right now?
Yep.
Not just on informing treatment
Yeah.
for post-birth, but being able to really understand, are there immunological preventative measures that can be put into place during pregnancy, or even prior to, if somebody knew they were going to get pregnant and
Right.
knew that this was a susceptibility that they could be looking at? Is that where the research is right now?
I mean, that is where we're headed, because while we like to understand what the problem is, we always like to try to figure out a solution, right? And that's an important part, because I think it's not enough to just say, okay, you're very likely to have a child with this type of autism. I want to be able to say, but this is what we can do, right? That's a very important part. I think it's always a gift to us when we can take what we're doing, in the research in the lab, and bring it to the families, bring it to our stakeholders, and give them better tools. But it's really important to be able to hopefully not just identify how something is happening, but potentially, do something about it. I mean, that's
Mhm.
kind of the ultimate, excuse me, for all of us working, in autism research. That is like our ultimate goal. And it's
Mhm.
not, I think, there's a struggle right now on sort of, not, I don't like to use the word prevent. What I like to use is the word to just give someone their best possible life, right? Without the challenges that someone might face. And some of those, I mean, like I said, for most of the kids whose mother have either, really this sort of inflammatory sequelae going on, this inflammatory model, or the autoantibodies, these are not the kids that are, you know, prodigies, geniuses, providing so much, to our community, but more the kids that are going to need a lifetime of care and help. And, that is something that we would like to lessen that burden on everyone.
No, for sure. And I mean, it's trying to figure out how to share that information too. And one of the challenges that we've had historically with being able to care for autistics and being able to make sure that we're providing the right supports at right times and within their journey is, how do you take what you're learning in the research, what you're learning in the medical side, and apply that to the practical treatment that's happening on the behavioral health side? What information are you able to provide when you do work with a family and they're able to be coached on, this is what I learned from my testing, is that, we're within this phenotype of autistic disorder, that this might be our journey or our path, or that there's a high prognosis for.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that you're sharing with the family that they can work with the provider to be able to, or that you could work directly with the provider to help inform on, to be able to create a better care model?
So I think, our model, certainly, I think we're a ways away from that in the maternal inflammation. because I think we just don't know enough about the nuances of that yet. I think with the maternal autoantibody, that has given us a little more, we've got a little more structure in that, in that scenario. I think for me, it's absolutely the most important part is that the provider is the contact point, right? Because the partnership and the partnerships that we want to develop, continue to develop, are sort of that back and forth. What do you need? And how can we help? But and what have we found, and what does that tell you? And so together, can we come up with a plan, an intervention plan, a plan for how we inform families. And the more we do on the research side, the more we understand, the more nuances we can sort of provide. And I think that's, as autism is so complicated. You've met a child with autism, you've met a child with autism, right? It is not there's no one size fits all. And I think we're getting into the precision medicine aspect of autism that I'm really excited about. That what is that child's journey? What does that child look like? And how do we help that child? Because it's very much a precision medicine approach from, my side. And my hope is to develop something that is available to everyone, and that we get a really broad clinical footprint with the providers that are providing the support and therapy for families.
It sounds extremely important for the communication with families. Is one of the things that I hear from families constantly is that they're not prepared for what the journey might feel like, be like, how long that journey might be before they can hit specific milestones. And they're looking for that information. And the more that you have inputs coming in from testing or from just being able to kind of evaluate what the research is telling you, I think that helps to put the family at ease, to help them understand this might be my journey, and then they can prepare for it. Is that kind of the coaching that you're hoping to see from the provider end when they gather this information? Is, hey, you know what, this gives me not a blueprint, but it gives me a projection of, this is the possible prognosis of how long care might take based off the medical components.
Yes, I mean, I think that is always our goal, and I think that's why I think we'd like to form these partnerships early, because this is a journey we need to take together. What do families need? What do providers need? And what do we have? And how do we communicate that? And how, what are as we continue to look at the clinical aspects, as we continue to refine our animal models, all of this builds the information, as it's the best we've got at this point in time, and helps us help families and the providers, and sort of understanding what that journey might look like. And here are the places that we can potentially shift, sort of how this is going to, their children are going to be impacted.
And the effort looks like it's there to be able to take all of the academic research and move it into the practical model, and so that it's implemented within community-based care. Where do you hope to see? Where are you hoping to be able to kind of view, like, hey, you know what, in a 5-year timeline, I would love it if the research moved us in this direction. Where are you hoping to see a lot of the efforts being placed?
So I think that there's sort of two parts to that. One is, we're at the point where we're transitioning this out of my lab and into a commercial, right? Trying to develop a commercial, because it has to be done that way to be, under FDA, sort of oversight, and to make sure that everything is just, we've got as tight process as we have, because you don't want to make mistakes, right? And we're trying to mitigate those as much as we can. So that's one side of it. The other side is the research continues in my program at UC Davis to better understand what is actually going on in the brain in this process. How is the brain changing? Some of the things that we're doing are, what are the downstream effects? By that I mean, here's the event. What is happening in the brain after that, right? We know what the antibodies bind to. We know what those proteins do, but there are other impacts of those proteins being impacted, especially when two or more of them are affected. And so we're working with that. Could we develop a druggable target, from that information? And so our animal models are incredibly important for that. We have some exciting data one of my graduate students is working on that I'm hopeful that it will give us a better picture of what's going on. And it's through that understanding that we go, okay, this is how the brain is going to be working, right, under this condition. So what can we potentially do about that? That's a very it's a very long-term goal, but I think it's a realistic goal, and that's where, again, the sort of that precision medicine thinking, just like we've done with cancer, right? You have cancer. Cancer is it's a very big umbrella, but now you can say, okay, you have colon cancer, but you have this kind of colon cancer and your genetics are this, so we can use this therapeutic, or this therapeutic's not going to work, right, because of your genetic. And that's where precision medicine has taken us in cancer. And I think as I work with families, I listen. That is my biggest job, right? What is going on, in their life, in their world? What are the things that we, as researchers, need to really pay attention to?
Yeah, there's nothing more valuable than actionable information, whether that's coming from the families or directly from the research, to be able to kind of put into place. And precision medicine is a good result of that. What what can families do right now to get more involved in the research process, to kind of be involved as participants, to be able to help guide, so that in 10 years they're helping the next families that are coming through? Are there ways to do that? Are there ways for them to actively try and help support some of the information that's coming out there?
I think one of the things that I will say is families are amazing at that. I mean, the autism community, family community is like, I get emails constantly. It's like, how can I help? I've read what you do. How can I help? What do I do? I mean, right now I don't have an active um, enrollment where we are, because we're using a lot of things that are already banked. But I think as we move the sort of the autoantibody technology out to the clinics, these we're going to like large centers of excellence, of where that are working in autism diagnosis and treatment, and participating in the studies as we do the clinical studies would be huge, right? Being able to um, gather additional information as to how well is this test working, how effective is this information, what do families need beyond, here's the other than what can I do about it, but what how can we help further, what do they, kind of identifying the needs, right, of the community as we move forward. I think, and clinicians, I mean, they're a huge part of this, right? We cannot do this by ourselves, right? The clinical community is absolutely key in helping us. I think when I started this, it's interesting. I mean, it was such an uphill battle to push that autoantibodies had anything to do with autism or even immunology. And now, I mean, it's like we'll get a review coming back. Well, of course we know the immune system is important in autism. I'm like, wow, it took us a really long time to get there. I mean, it's nice when you're, when you've got something and you can get to that point of translating that something, into something useful, but also that's accepted. That's a big moment.
And where can folks turn to? Because even for clinicians, is that this
Mm-hmm.
subject is, it's sometimes tough to digest. It's tough to understand all of it, because that's not everybody's field of practice. And for
Right.
families, even more so, it's how do you break it down so that everybody can understand and support the information that's coming out, and also be able to take advantage of it? Are there resources out there? Are there places that you're saying, hey, go here first?
I think, well, so the UC Davis Mind Institute has a really fantastic resource center, both online and in person. So we're in the Sacramento area, but there's a lot of information online, a lot of information on what we're all doing as researchers, right, that are affiliated with the institute. Um, my company that I've developed to try to get this out, not to plug the company, but marabio.com, we have a whole, like a very digestible, what does the immune system have to do with autism? What is MAR, autism, as we call it, maternal autoantibody related autism, just to understand the nuts and bolts of that type of work. But I would say, those are places that we have very content that is geared to families and to clinicians to help them understand, what we're doing, what we have found, what it means, and hopefully what we can do about it in the future.
Well, I appreciate all the information that you've shared, and it's kind of giving me that extra push to say, I probably need to go read about this a little bit more myself. And hopefully it does that for the rest of the audience, is that the more that we can empower ourselves with information, the better we are going to be able to work with our partners, to be able to collaborate, coordinate. So I appreciate you taking the time today, Judy, and being able to
Absolutely.
share your story.
Thanks so much for having me, and a pleasure. And if I can provide further information, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.